So the first question we would like to make you is basically if you think we currently live in a democracy in the sense of having the rule of the people. So do you think we have democracy right now?
Democracy is not a yes or no affair, has many dimensions. So take the United States, where the question has been extensively studied, also the most important case because of the US role in the world, and it's also its status of one of the oldest democracies. So in the United States, mainstream research in the academic political sciences shows quite decisively that a large majority of the population are literally unrepresented, meaning their own representatives pay no attention to their opinions. This is quite readily studied. We know about people's attitudes and opinions from extensive and serious polling work, and you can tell what the representatives vote for, so you can then compare them and see what the correlation is. And it turns out that for maybe 3/4 of the population, the lowest on the income wealth scale, the correlation is essentially zero, meaning their own representatives are listening to different voices. You want to find out what the voices is, or look for other work in mainstream academic political science, which shows that the electability is remarkably closely correlated with campaign spending, particularly strategic campaign spending, which has escalated since with dark money since the Supreme Court decisions on Citizens United and others. But it's always been true over a century. You get a virtually straight line when you compare electability to Congress with campaign spending. Well, where does campaign spending come from? Especially strategic campaign spending. Concentrations of economic power. What that tells you is that when someone is elected to Congress, the first thing they have to do is get on the telephone to call the donors to make sure the donors will support them in the next election. Meanwhile, hordes of lobbyists are descending on the congressional offices, overwhelming the few staff members, ending up pretty much writing the legislation, which the congressional representative then comes back and signs. I mean, that's a bit of a caricature, but a substantial, very significant element of the way democracy functions. So is it democracy? In a certain sense. You know, you're not shot if you vote for somebody people power systems don't like, but there's all kinds of measures taken to ensure that class war continues without disruption. That's quite apart from the means that are used to distort elections. So right now in Republican-run states, there are extensive measures being taken to redirect, reorganize, gerrymander, reorganize electoral districts to ensure that the Republicans can remain in power even if they fail on electoral votes, which happens regularly, incidentally. The Republicans usually lose elections for Congress and president, but win the election because of the way the anti-democratic system is structured. So in 2016, Clinton won by 3 million votes, but lost the election in a landslide. Trump lost by 7 million votes and came very close to winning the election. There are structural reasons for this. Democratic votes tend to be concentrated in urban areas, working class, minority, poor, and so on. Republican votes are scattered through the rural areas, thin number of votes, but lots of districts. They tend to be conservative, white supremacist, Christian, evangelical, and so on. So you have a situation in which a minority of the population, which tends to be rather reactionary, have an overwhelming structural advantage. That's even apart from the Senate, which is radically undemocratic. 500,000 people in Wyoming have the same number of senators as 47 million in California. Actually, the Senate was set up that way by the framers. They wanted the Senate to be the most important sector of government. As James Madison put it, the Senate should be the wealth of the nation, people who recognize the rights of property owners, because the main goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The main scholarly book on the Constitution is entitled, Michael Klorman, the gold standard in scholarship. The title is The Framers' Coup, how the framers of the Constitution carried out a coup against the democratic aspirations of the majority. And this has been going on in one or another way ever since. Now it happens to be extreme with a kind of proto-fascist party, the Republicans, now in the hands of a megalomaniac who's worshipped by his adherents. They're basically trying to destroy what remains of democracy. So that's the United States. Take a look at other countries. You have to look closely and see exactly what's going on. Not very pretty when you look closely.
So you would say, like, as you just said, like, we know, for example, that campaign spending predicts who gets elected, right? We also have the rise of populism around the world. So would you say that democracy is more in danger now than it was before?
That democracy, sorry.
Is more in danger now that
more in danger?
Yeah.
Oh, it's not just my opinion. There are international commissions meeting discussing the future of democracy, which are drawing the same conclusion. In the United States, it's in very severe danger. In fact, next year, 2022, might be the death knell for American democracy. The Republicans have a very effective strategy. It's been announced, it's public, nothing secret about it. It's announced by Mitch McConnell, the leading figure in the Republican Party. He says the goal is to ensure that the Democratic administration can achieve nothing. We must harm the country as much as possible and then blame it on the Democrats. And meanwhile, concoct all kind of fairy tales about how communist Democrats are indoctrinating little children to think that if they have white skin that they're criminals and so on and so forth. This is working very well, and it'll probably bring the Republicans into power. After that, the Republican Party is basically owned by Donald Trump, a dangerous megalomaniac psychopath who has no interest in anything except power for himself, which may drive the country and the world to disaster. We're very close to it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you don't have to take my opinion. You can read journals like the London Financial Times, the leading business journal in the world. Their most respected correspondent, Martin Wolf, economic political correspondent, recently had a column warning that the Republican Party is driving the United States towards what he called autocracy. Others call it a form of proto-fascism. Look at positions the Republican Party, by international standards, ranks alongside the extremist right-wing parties in Europe with neo-fascist origins, like AfD in Germany.
Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, what do you think should be like what can we, the citizens, do to improve democracy in this sense?
Well, these are still very free countries. There is repression, but nothing like in the dictatorships or the really authoritarian countries, which means there are a lot of options open to struggle against this. I can talk, different issues in different countries, but say, take the United States. There's legislation being debated right now, which has a very interesting character. Turns out that the Biden legislation, which is very unlikely to pass, Republicans are 100% opposed, and there are enough Democrats to sabotage it, right-wing Democrats. You take a look at the provisions in the legislation, the individual provisions. Turns out they're very popular, including among Republicans. On the other hand, if you look at people's attitudes towards the legislation, they tend to oppose it. They think it'll harm them. And then if you ask, do they know what provisions are in the legislation? Answer, no. So we have a remarkably effective propaganda system, which leads to the consequence that people favor the provisions, oppose the legislation, because they don't know that the provisions are in the legislation. That's effective propaganda, very effective. And going back to your question, that leaves opportunities. The opportunity of organizing, reaching out to the public, overcoming the indoctrination and control, which keeps people from knowing what are the choices open to them. In fact, the Democratic Party leadership could be doing this. What they could be doing, but don't, is insisting on a vote for each individual provision of the legislation. So say take child care, take maternal leave. Okay? The United States is about the only country in the world that doesn't have paid maternal leave. Other countries, like say Brazil, which is hardly a model of democracy, has 4 months guaranteed maternal leave, 2 months optional at public expense. The United States has 0. The only countries like the United States are a couple of islands in the Pacific. Well, the public is in favor of maternal leave. So what the Democrats could do, if they were a popular party, would be, okay, let's have a specific vote on maternal leave, on expanding medical care, on child care, on environmental measures. Go through the list, have separate votes on them. That way you would expose the Republicans who are opposed. They'd have to go to their own constituents and say, here's why I oppose what you want. Well, the Democrats won't do that. They don't want to open that door. The Democrat Party managers would prefer to lose elections than to open the door to popular democracy. So they don't do the obvious things. But as far as the public could compel them to do it by pressures, that works. But you got to get organized and active for that.
So, you talked about indoctrination. So, what do you think about the media in general? So, do you think that media should have a stronger regulation, for example, about spreading fake news and misinformation? Do you think the state should have a role on that, or?
I think the problem is, there is a problem of fake news and misinformation on the right media. So if you take a look at the Murdoch media, Fox News, full of lies and misinformation, and it reaches most of the right wing. If you're a Republican, you probably look only at Fox News. So you're being fed a flood of lies and misinformation. If you take the mainstream serious journals, New York Times, Washington Post, the problem is not misinformation. It's lack of information. Things that they don't report, or that they report it or comment on in a way that is shaped by their own doctrinal concerns. So they don't publish outright lies. There's a lot of shaping, filtering, choices, and so on, which can lead to a very misleading picture of the world.
So we know that, for example, and you talk a lot about this. So we know that wages are lower now than they were in the 80s in the US, right? The wages. We also know that tech millionaires, they pay almost no tax at all. So do you think there is any incompatibility between democracy and capitalism in general?
Well, first of all, the business world has never permitted capitalism. Never. They will never tolerate capitalism. They want a powerful state which protects their interests. That's not capitalism. Right. It's a variety of state capitalism in which the state is basically the instrument of private power to a large extent and serves their interests. So, semi-capitalism. Markets are for the poor and working people. They have to throw themselves on the market and try to survive, not for the rich. The rich live in what some economists call a bailout economy. If we get into trouble, we get bailed out. And it's not just the bailouts. The IMF did a study a couple of years ago of the profits of the biggest banks. Profits, not bailouts. Turns out their profits, to a substantial extent, are based on an implicit government insurance policy. In the United States, it's called too big to fail. Like if you get into trouble, the friendly taxpayer will take care of you. That gives them, the big banks, access to cheap credit, inflated credit ratings. They can take risky, profitable investments, and if anything goes wrong, they get bailed out, so it doesn't matter. That amounts to tens of billions of dollars of subsidies a year, practically their whole profit. In fact, we're watching this right now in Glasgow. The big news in Glasgow, big excitement. John Kerry, in his excited address at Glasgow, said, now we're really going to solve the problem. We have the markets on our side. The big banks, investment firms, private equity firms have said they're with us. How can we lose? They're saying we have $130 trillion that we can use to deal with climate change. We've won, except when you look at the footnote. You take a look at the footnote. Yes, $130 trillion, which we are happy to invest if we can make profit and if we are guaranteed that there will be no risk by IMF guarantees against loss. So if we can make profit and face no risk, we're delighted to invest. Wonderful. We're saved. That's capitalism.
So what do you think should be the role of the elite in general, like corporate or intellectuals? What do you think the elite can do?
First of all, I don't think there should be or even is an elite. There's an elite in terms of power, but not in terms of other criteria. Intellectuals are people like us, people who are privileged. A lot of people don't have time to sit around and read and write and discuss issues with each other. They're too busy trying to put food on the table. So intellectuals are a privileged class who happen to be spend some of their time and interest in public issues. If, say, a Nobel Prize physicist is sitting in his lab 60 hours a week and doesn't care about the world, we don't call him an intellectual. If the janitor who cleans his floor happens to have a lot of knowledge and insight into public affairs, we don't call him an intellectual. It has to be somebody privileged who deals with public issues. What's their responsibility? Well, it follows from privilege. If you have a privilege, you have responsibility. The responsibility is to work for the common good. If you happen to be a privileged intellectual, you can try to bring to the general public what is being suppressed, distorted, modified. So, for example, you can bring to the public the things we've just been talking about. Very few people know what we've been talking about. Well, that's the task of an honest intellectual. It's not the task that's fulfilled. If you look at the record, intellectuals have overwhelmingly been servants of power. That's always true. Go through the record. I mean, the term intellectual was used in the modern sense for the first time at the time of the Dreyfus trial. Zola, other intellectuals criticized the army and the state. They weren't popular. They were bitterly condemned by the honored, respectable intellectuals, the immortals of the French Academy, bitterly condemned them. What are these writers and artists doing criticizing our great institutions like the army and the state? In fact, Émile Zola had to flee France. That's the usual record. Could run through it. So intellectuals there is a responsibility that honest, decent, privileged intellectuals have. There is something quite different that they do overwhelmingly. There are, of course, exceptions.
Yeah, but the problem is that most intellectuals or scholars, they are being funded by the state, right? So do you think there is a conflict of interest? Like, because most intellectuals are being funded by the state, right? By governments through to universities and science. So do you think there is a conflict of interest, or what do you think an intellectual can do to be politically active, but also being funded continuously doing his work?
Well, if you're an honest intellectual, you can expect negative reactions, both from the mainstream of the intellectual world and from power centers. It's pretty obvious. It goes back to classical Greece. Now, who is it who had to drink the hemlock? The man who was asking too many questions. He was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking them to think about things. So he had to commit suicide. Well, that's the general pattern. Today, we don't, at least in the West, you don't throw critical intellectuals into torture chambers. You do it in other countries, but not in the West. What you do is defame them, attack them, undermine their positions. Also, I could give you endless examples, even from my own experience, and I'm privileged. But that, that comes with trying to be a critic of power systems. You want to be a servant of power? Fine, you're well off. You're treated very nicely. You want to be a critic of power? You're going to suffer from it in different ways, depending on the society. That goes back millennia.
Yeah. So you touched already on this, but I want to go a bit further deep. So when we study empirically if citizens are informed or not when they vote, we discover that a vast majority of citizens, they don't have information relevant to do the voting. So do you think this is a problem? And if it is, how do you think we can create a solution for this?
Well, there's plenty of solutions. One solution, the main one, is organization. When Reagan and Thatcher instituted the neoliberal assault on general society back in around 1980, the first thing they did, rightly from their point of view, was to attack labor unions, both of them. First act, try to undermine and destroy labor. That made sense. When you're going to carry out bitter, brutal class war, make sure people don't have a way to defend themselves. And the main way to defend themselves is by labor unions. So we have to destroy those. And that was in fact picked up by their successors, including the Democrats in the United States, New Labor in England, and others elsewhere. So the main way for people to become informed is to have organizations where you can talk to each other, you can share information, you can make plans, you can think together, and so on. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 1930s. Take a look back at the 1930s. There was a serious crisis. The Depression was very serious. I lived with it as a child. My family were immigrants, unemployed, working class. But they were hopeful because they had unions. My unemployed aunts, seamstresses, could be members of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which had cultural events, classes, a week in the country, organization. You're part of something. You can get together, you can think, you can act collectively. That was happening around the country. CIO was getting organized, militant labor actions, political groups. Well, what happened in the 30s? There were two ways out of the crisis. Europe took one way, the United States took another way. Europe moved to fascism. The United States moved to social democracy. In fact, the New Deal measures basically pioneered the measures that Europe took in the post-war era. Now, ironically, it's reversed. We have a crisis. The United States is moving towards fascism. Europe is holding on to some, at least, of social democracy. But how to get over the crisis? Same way it's always done. People have to become organized, active, understanding the reality around them. Intellectuals can play a role in this, what Gramsci called organic intellectuals, who play a part in the class struggle, join with people and provide them with what they can offer with their special privileges and advantages by being part of this. You go back to the 1930s, that was being done. prominent scientists were teaching worker education classes in union organizations, writing books like Mathematics for the Millions by a left mathematician trying to explain the basis of mathematics for ordinary population. Einstein was doing that with popular works on relativity, popular works, things that I read with my 10-year-old son when he was getting interested in science. Okay? Plenty of things that intellectuals can do, be part of movements and contribute to them in many ways. But you pay a price. You're not going to be loved. You're going to be denounced, attacked, have your office vandalized, have your book suppressed, have to have police protection at the talks. That's all from my own experience. For others, it's much worse. So you can expect that. That comes with being a critic.
Mm-hmm. So, do you have any thoughts about the current situation of Brazil, with Bolsonaro, the president, threatening the results of the follow-up election? Similarly with Trump, right?
Well, better than I do, Brazil, Bolsonaro announced that he'll either he's not going to be tried, he'll block that, and if he loses the election, it's because of fraud. Mm-hmm. He's now, the main love of his life, as he said, in fact, I love you, is Donald Trump. And now that he's following Trump's program exactly. In fact, the same people are behind it, like Steve Bannon is advising him on how to deal with the possibility that he would lose an election. How do you deal with it? Claim that the election was stolen, claim that it was fraud. In the United States, a large majority of Republicans, 2/3, 3/4, think that the election was stolen. I mean, there isn't a particle of evidence for that. It's pure, outright lies. But it's reached 2/3 of Republicans, 3/4 maybe, and it, for example, motivated the people who tried to carry out a coup. There was an attempted coup in January 6th. Mm-hmm. Republicans like to deny it, but when you try to overthrow an elected government by force, that's a coup. Mm-hmm. Okay? They didn't happen to have the military on their side. Bolsonaro is hoping that he'll have the military on his side. Well, so far, I don't think it's clear. He did call for a kind of a military demonstration a couple of weeks ago. The military didn't come out. His supporters did, but not the military. But he's been replacing generals, calling them the Brazilian, nobody knows what's up. And I think there are more generals in the government now than probably there were under the dictatorship. Mm-hmm. So, and of course he has the police on his side, and the militias and so on. It's a scary situation in the United States too. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, it's quite interesting what's happening with Lula. He's traveling around Europe, being treated with enormous respect and honor, invited to parliaments, conservative parliaments. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro and his sons are riding around on motorcycles like a motorcycle king. That's Europe. Turn to the United States. None of this is reported. Mm-hmm. The only reason I know it is because my wife, Valeria, who's Brazilian, tunes in on the Brazilian news where it's reported, but I don't read it in the New York Times. It's pressed here. They don't lie about it. You just don't report the fact that the person we don't want, Social Democrat, is being feted throughout Europe. Well, the power systems here do want Bolsonaro, right-winger, is being treated like a joke. You just don't report that. You don't report that Paulo Guedes, one of the richest people in Brazil by now, I suppose, is loved by the investment community, but not by anybody else. If your slogan is, in his words, privatize everything, it's going to be a disaster for Brazil, but wonderful for foreign investors as they buy up the country. So that's what you see reported.
So, after all this, and before opening the questions for the class, I have one last question for you. So, are you optimistic about the future of democracy? Or?
Well, to go back to Gramsci and the slogan that he made famous, we should have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. There are plenty of opportunities. Objectively, I don't think the future looks bright. We may not even survive. And take a look at take a look at Glasgow. There were two events there. Inside the halls of Glasgow were the people with the suits and the ties who were working out ways to destroy the human species. Outside the halls of Glasgow in the streets, there were tens of thousands of people, mostly young, saying, we want to save the world. We want to create we want to survive and make a better world. Well, those are two forces. Which one's going to prevail? That's up to us.